At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law slapped my wife in front of 200 guests. "Get out of here, old woman," she screamed. "Nobody wants you here." My son just stood there and watched. He said absolutely nothing. But after I made one single phone call, their arrogant smiles permanently disappeared. My name is William Harrison, though most people just call me Bill. I am 70 years old. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that families should be built on respect, and if you have ever had to stand up to people who severely underestimated your worth. The evening began in a sprawling, opulent ballroom at a luxury estate in the wealthy suburbs of Chicago. It was the kind of venue that demanded perfection. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the flawless floral arrangements. A classical string quartet played softly in the background. The room was filled with venture capitalists, startup founders, and the corporate elite. These were the people funding my son Jason's tech company, Novatech. My wife Martha and I were completely out of place in that sea of wealth and ambition. I was wearing my best suit, but it was an older cut, bought off the rack years ago. I am a retired commercial real estate developer now, but my roots are blue-collar. I spent my early years as a metal mechanic working with my hands, and I still prefer my old pickup truck to any luxury sedan. Martha wore a modest, tasteful dress. She is 68 years old, the kindest woman I have ever known, and she was still recovering her strength after suffering a mild stroke late last year. She was nervous. She wanted everything to be perfect for our only son. We were standing near the edge of the dance floor when Jason's new bride Victoria approached. Victoria was the chief financial officer of Jason's company. She came from a family that had lost their wealth to bankruptcy years ago, but she carried herself with a cold, aristocratic superiority. She was wearing a custom bridal gown that cost $15,000. She paraded through the room like royalty, soaking in the admiration of the wealthy investors. Martha took a step back to give Victoria more room to pass. But Martha's hands had a slight tremor, a lingering effect from her stroke. She was holding a crystal flute filled with champagne. As Victoria brushed past us with a sharp, impatient turn, her elbow bumped Martha's arm. It was just a single drop. One tiny drop of champagne splashed onto the pristine white fabric of Victoria's designer dress. What happened next defied all reason and decency. Victoria gasped, looking down at the microscopic damp spot on her gown. Her face twisted into a mask of absolute fury. She did not ask if Martha was all right. She did not pause to assess the situation. Without a second of hesitation, Victoria raised her hand and struck my wife. The slap was vicious. It sounded like a gunshot, echoing over the soft classical music. The force of the blow caught Martha completely off guard. She stumbled backward, her frail legs giving out beneath her. I reached out, my heart dropping into my stomach, but I was not fast enough. Martha crashed hard onto the cold, polished marble floor. The crystal champagne flute shattered into dozens of jagged pieces around her. Victoria stood over my wife, her chest heaving with rage. She pointed a manicured finger at the woman who had given birth to her husband. "Get out of here, old woman," Victoria screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the grand hall. "Nobody wants you here." Time seemed to stop completely. I looked down at Martha. She was trembling, holding her reddened cheek, tears welling in her gentle eyes. I looked at her hands pressing against her face. Those hands were rough and deeply calloused. They were the hands of a mother who had spent countless late nights doing alterations, sewing clothes for neighbors, and saving every spare penny she could find. She had worked her fingers to the bone to pay the exorbitant tuition for Jason to attend the Wharton School of Business. She had sacrificed her own comfort, her own youth to give our son the foundation he needed to stand in this very room. And now that same son was standing just 2 steps away. I looked up at Jason. I waited for the outrage. I waited for my son to step forward, to defend the mother who had given him everything, to reprimand the woman who had just assaulted her. But Jason did nothing. He looked at his mother bleeding on the marble floor, and then he looked away. He shifted his weight casually, brushed a speck of imaginary dust off his tailored Tom Ford suit, and kept his mouth shut. He was more concerned about maintaining his image in front of the wealthy investors than defending his own family. I slowly knelt down beside the shattered glass. I ignored the gasps and the whispers rippling through the crowd. My focus was entirely on Martha. I gently took her trembling hands into mine, checking for cuts from the broken crystal. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a humiliating mixture of pain and shame. She was apologizing. My beautiful, selfless wife was actually trying to whisper an apology to me for ruining the moment. I felt a rage burning deep inside my chest, hotter and brighter than any forge I had ever worked in. It was a consuming fire, but I forced it down. In my 30 years of ruthless commercial real estate negotiations, I had learned one absolute truth. Anger makes you sloppy. Cold, calculated logic makes you untouchable. I wiped a single tear from Martha's cheek and helped her to her feet, shielding her fragile frame with my own. I looked around the room. The faces of the venture capitalists stared back at me, a mix of pity and disgust. They saw an old mechanic and his clumsy wife. They saw a liability to their bright, shiny tech investment. Victoria stood her ground, her chin raised in defiance, proud of her cruelty. Jason finally met my gaze, but his eyes were empty. He gave me a subtle, dismissive nod toward the exit, silently begging me to take out the trash and leave his perfect night intact. The string quartet had stopped playing abruptly. The lively chatter of 200 guests died out in an instant. The entire ballroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Every single eye in the room was fixed on us, waiting to see what the old out-of-place father would do. They expected me to yell. They expected a scene. They expected the clueless old man to lose his temper and make a fool of himself. But they did not know me. They did not know the kind of man I truly was. They all thought I was powerless. They all thought they held the cards. They had no idea that the silent, poorly dressed old man holding his weeping wife was the only reason any of them were standing in this room. They were about to learn that disrespecting my family comes with a catastrophic price. I kept my arm firmly around Martha, supporting her weight as she leaned against me. I looked across the short distance separating me from my son. Jason was standing right there, motionless, frozen like a coward in the bright glow of the chandelier lights. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy I had stayed up with until 2 a.m, helping with complicated math homework. The boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose tears I had wiped away. I stared at him, offering him one last chance to be a man. One final opportunity to step up, look his new wife in the eye, and demand respect for the woman who gave him life. He felt the weight of my gaze. I know he did. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then at the stained hem of Victoria's dress, and finally, for a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine. There was no warmth in them. There was no guilt. There was only a profound, calculating annoyance. He was doing the math in his head, weighing the value of his parents against the value of the venture capitalists watching the scene unfold. We were a bad investment. We were a liability to his brand. Slowly, deliberately, Jason broke eye contact. He turned his head away, raised his right hand, and casually flicked a piece of invisible lint off the lapel of his tailored jacket. That small, dismissive gesture severed the last remaining tie between us. It was the precise moment I realized the son I had raised was dead. He had not just married a cruel woman. He had adopted her soul. He had fully crossed over to the other side, blinded by the hollow allure of money and status. He had sold his integrity for a seat at the table of the elite, and he was more than willing to pay the admission price with his mother's dignity. A heavy hand landed firmly on my shoulder. I turned my head and saw 2 large security guards dressed in dark suits standing directly behind us. They had earpieces discreetly tucked into their ears and wore stern, uncompromising expressions that left absolutely no room for any negotiation or debate. "Sir," one of them said, his voice deep and vibrating with practiced authority, I am going to have to ask you and the lady to leave the premises immediately. We do not want any trouble tonight. Please come with us quietly." He tightened his grip on my jacket, clearly expecting resistance. I looked past the guard and saw Victoria whispering to the event coordinator, a smug, victorious smirk playing on her lips. She had given the order. She had deemed us unworthy to breathe the same air as her affluent guests, and she was having us thrown out of the very wedding I had quietly subsidized. The utter audacity of it was staggering. The venture capitalists at the nearby tables began to turn back to their conversations, their interest waning now that the unpleasantness was being efficiently removed from their sight. I felt Martha tense beside me. A fresh wave of tears streamed down her cheeks. She clung to my arm, terrified of making an even bigger scene. "Let us just go, Bill," she whispered, her voice trembling with humiliation. "Please, let us just go home. I am so sorry." I gently squeezed her hand, trying to offer some small comfort. "You have absolutely nothing to be sorry for, my love," I murmured softly, making sure only she could hear me. "You are the most gracious person in this entire building. Do not shed another tear for people who are not worth your sorrow." I turned back to the security guard. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to shove his hand away. I simply looked at him with the cold, deadpan stare I used to reserve for hostile boardroom negotiations. "Take your hand off my wife and me," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and chillingly polite. "We are perfectly capable of walking out the door on our own." The guard hesitated for a second, perhaps surprised that the shabby old man was not cowering or shouting. He slowly released my shoulder and stepped back, gesturing toward the grand exit doors at the far end of the ballroom. We began the long walk toward the exit. The ballroom felt miles wide. Every step resonated with the heavy silence of the crowd. I kept my head high, supporting Martha, ensuring her pace was steady. I did not look back at Jason. I did not look at Victoria. They had made their choice, and now they were going to have to live with it. As the heavy wooden doors closed behind us, cutting off the soft strains of the string quartet, the cool evening air hit my face. I stopped in the middle of the grand foyer, away from the prying eyes of the guests. I gently guided Martha to a plush velvet bench near the cloakroom. "Sit here for just a moment, sweetheart," I said softly. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn suit jacket. I bypassed the sleek smartphone Jason had bought me for my birthday, and instead pulled out my old battered flip phone. It was a secure line, untraceable, a relic from my days dealing with cutthroat property acquisitions. I flipped it open, my thumb pressing the familiar numbers with practiced precision. The line rang twice before a sharp, alert voice answered on the other end. "Yes, Bill," the voice said. It was Richard Cole, my personal attorney and the most ruthless wealth manager in the state of Illinois. I looked back at the closed ballroom doors, visualizing the smug faces of my son and his new wife. "Richard," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "Activate Directive Alpha. Now." I snapped the flip phone shut and slipped it back into my breast pocket. The heavy oak doors of the estate closed behind us with a definitive thud, shutting out the classical music and the murmurs of the elite. I kept my arm securely around Martha, guiding her down the sweeping stone steps and into the expansive parking lot. The crisp night air offered a brief moment of clarity. Our vehicle, an old reliable Ford pickup truck, was parked at the very edge of the lot, deliberately hidden by the valets away from the sleek sports cars and luxury sedans. Before we could even reach the gravel pathway, the sound of urgent footsteps echoed behind us. I stopped and turned. It was Jason. He was jogging down the steps, loosening his silk tie, his face flushed. For a fleeting second, the foolish, hopeful part of a father's heart thought he had come to apologize. I thought he had realized the magnitude of his wife's cruelty and ran out to beg for his mother's forgiveness. But as he stepped under the glow of the parking lot streetlights, I saw his eyes. He was not looking at Martha's bruised cheek. He was nervously scanning the perimeter, checking to ensure none of his wealthy investors had wandered outside to witness this interaction. Dad. Wait a second. Jason panted, catching his breath as he stepped in front of us. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, feigning a look of exhausted burden. Look, you guys need to understand what is happening here. Victoria did not mean to snap like that. She is pregnant. The lie hung in the cool air, cheap and transparent. Her hormones are completely out of control right now. Jason continued, his words rushing out in a practiced rhythm. She has been incredibly stressed about the wedding and the baby. You know how it is, Mom. She just lost her temper over the dress. It was a reflex. Please do not make a massive deal out of this. I stared at my son, marveling at the ease with which the deception flowed from his lips. I had spent 40 years negotiating commercial real estate deals with some of the most deceitful sharks in Chicago. I knew when a man was feeding me garbage. Victoria was not pregnant. She had been drinking champagne all evening. But Jason needed a plausible excuse, a convenient shield, to justify his wife's abhorrent behavior and to pacify the clueless old man he assumed I was. I looked at his posture, at the frantic energy radiating from him. Jason was the chief executive officer of Novatech, a software startup he constantly boasted was valued at $100 million. He had spent the last 5 years meticulously crafting an image for himself. He wanted the world to see him as a brilliant, self-made tech genius who built his empire purely on intellect and innovation. He frequently gave interviews to business magazines, carefully omitting the financial safety net I had provided for his entire life. He viewed my wealth with barely concealed contempt. To Jason, my massive portfolio of industrial parks, logistics, warehouses, and commercial complexes was nothing but dirty blue-collar money. He found my calloused hands and faded flannel shirts embarrassing. He believed his clean digital world of venture capital and software algorithms made him vastly superior to a man who made his fortune dealing with cement, steel, and tenant disputes. He conveniently forgot that my dirty money paid for his Ivy League education, his first apartment, and the very clothes on his back. Listen to me, Jason said, taking a step closer, his tone shifting from pleading to demanding. Bradley Sterling is sitting inside that ballroom right now. Do you know who that is? He is the biggest venture capitalist in the Midwest. He is about to lead our Series B funding round. I have spent 2 years courting this guy. I cannot have any messy family drama ruining this night. If he thinks I come from a chaotic, unstable background, he might pull the term sheet. He was not asking us for forgiveness. He was managing a public relations crisis. His mother was standing right in front of him, physically trembling from being assaulted, and his only concern was his funding round. Mom, Jason said, briefly glancing at Martha before looking back at the venue doors. I am sorry about the dress thing, but you really need to go. Just head home, get some rest, and we will talk about this after the honeymoon, when everyone has calmed down. Okay, he did not wait for an answer. Jason stepped forward, placed his hands on my shoulders, and began physically turning me toward the far end of the parking lot. He was actually hurting us. He kept checking his watch and glancing nervously over his shoulder, terrified that Bradley Sterling or one of the other venture capitalists might step outside for a smoke and see the brilliant tech CEO pushing his shabby parents toward a rusted pickup truck. Let us just get you to your car, Jason insisted, his grip tightening as he practically shoved us forward. It is getting late anyway. Drive safe. He guided us all the way to the truck, opened the heavy passenger door, and stood there waiting. He was ensuring the trash was properly disposed of before he returned to his elite circle. I helped Martha into the cab, making sure she was secure. Then I walked around to the driver's side. I looked over the roof of the truck at my son. He offered a strained, artificial smile, gave a quick wave, and immediately turned his back on us, sprinting back toward the brilliantly lit mansion. He did not look back once. I climbed slowly into the driver's seat, tightly gripping the steering wheel, and closed the heavy metal door. The engine roared to life, but my mind was already calculating my next incredibly destructive move. I watched my son jogging toward the brilliant lights of the mansion. Before he could reach the grand staircase, he stopped. I saw the sudden hesitation in his posture. He turned around, his shoulders tense, clearly realizing he had not actually secured my verbal agreement to stay silent. He needed absolute assurance that the messy old folks would not cause a scene or embarrass him further. He jogged toward the truck, waving to signal me to wait. I pressed the button to roll down the heavy glass window. The cold night wind rushed into the cab, bringing with it the distant sound of the string quartet. Jason leaned his forearms against the doorframe, invading my space. He looked at Martha, who was staring blankly at her trembling hands in the passenger seat, and then he looked at me. His eyes searched my weathered face for any sign of rebellion. "Dad," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I need to know we are good here. Victoria is highly emotional right now with the baby. You know how women get. I need you to promise me that you will just go home and let this go. It is my wedding night. I cannot have you two holding a grudge and making things difficult for us tomorrow." I sat there in the dimly lit cab wearing my faded flannel jacket over my cheap suit. I looked every bit the tired, defeated old mechanic he believed me to be. It was a role I had perfected over decades. When I first transitioned from pouring concrete to buying commercial properties, the wealthy developers of Chicago took one look at my rough hands and simple clothes and assumed I was an uneducated fool. They thought they could easily swindle me out of prime real estate. But I built an empire precisely because I allowed them to underestimate me. I let them believe they were the smartest men in the room, while I quietly read every single microscopic tell in their body language. I learned to spot a liar from a mile away. I looked at my son, reading him with the same cold precision I used on those ruthless developers. The slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his eyes darted away when he mentioned the baby, the complete absence of genuine empathy in his hollow voice. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that Victoria was not pregnant. It was a calculated, desperate lie fabricated on the spot to manipulate me into submission. They were using a non-existent grandchild as a shield to protect her vicious cruelty. My son was standing right in front of me, lying directly to my face, expecting me to swallow the deception simply because I was old and supposedly naive. But I did not let a single trace of my anger show. I allowed my shoulders to slump, mimicking the posture of a weary, clueless old man who was easily intimidated by the modern, sophisticated world. I let my expression soften into one of complete, docile acceptance. I deliberately slowed my breathing to appear perfectly harmless. "I understand, Jason," I said, keeping my voice gentle and slightly raspy. I offered him a weak, submissive nod, playing the part flawlessly. "I am sorry we caused such a massive disruption tonight. We never intended to ruin your special evening or upset Victoria in any way. It was just a clumsy accident. Your mother and I will go straight home right now and get completely out of your hair. We will not cause any more trouble for you or your important investors. You just focus on your beautiful bride and your expanding company. We will talk whenever you are ready and have the time." The transformation in Jason was absolutely instantaneous. The rigid tension holding his body together that completely dissolved into the cool air. He let out a long sigh of relief, his chest deflating as he pushed away from the sturdy doorframe of the truck. He had heard exactly what he needed to hear from his foolish father. He was thoroughly convinced that he had successfully managed the entire volatile situation, pacified his emotional parents, and protected his precious public image from any potential scandal. He believed his superficial charm and transparent lies had worked flawlessly to subdue me. "Thanks, Dad," Jason said, a genuine smile breaking through his anxious facade. "I appreciate you being so understanding and reasonable about all of this. I truly do. Drive safe, and I will call you guys sometime next week when things settle down." He took a step back, gave a dismissive pat on the rusted side panel of the pickup truck, and turned his back on us for good. I watched him walk away, with a light, energetic stride, completely relieved that the unpleasant burden of his family had been so easily handled. He disappeared through the grand double doors, eager to return to the venture capitalists, the champagne, and his new aristocratic wife. He was entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that he had just permanently sealed his own fate. I rolled the heavy glass window back up, sealing us inside the quiet cab. Martha sniffled softly beside me, still clutching her bruised cheek. She reached out and placed her trembling hand over mine on the steering wheel. "I am so sorry, Bill," she whispered again. I turned to her, my heart aching at her pain, but my resolve hardening now. "Do not ever apologize for their sins," I replied softly. I shifted the truck into gear and slowly drove out of the gravel lot. The dark suburban roads stretched ahead. My outward demeanor remained perfectly calm, but underneath my faded flannel shirt, my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I was no longer an old man retreating in defeat. I was a predator meticulously stalking its prey. The heavy tires of the old pickup truck crunched loudly against the loose gravel as we pulled onto the main road, leaving the brilliantly lit estate completely behind us in the dark. The night was bitterly cold, wrapping around the cabin like a thick, suffocating blanket. I drove in absolute silence, my eyes fixed firmly on the cracked asphalt, illuminated by the yellow headlights. Martha sat quietly beside me, resting her head against the cool glass of the passenger window. Her breathing remarkably slow and profoundly exhausted. The violent sting of the brutal slap had left a dark purple bruise forming rapidly on her cheek, but the emotional wound was far deeper. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. My mind was already mapping out the total financial destruction of the son who had so easily abandoned us. I had spent 40 grueling years building an impenetrable fortress of lucrative commercial real estate across the region. Directive Alpha was my ultimate failsafe, a legally binding protocol designed to instantly lock down every single liquid asset transfer, all property deeds, into an untouchable blind trust, and sever any active financial ties to my family members. It was a ruthless, scorched earth maneuver that I had never wanted to use, but Jason had forced my hand tonight. We had barely traveled 3 miles down the winding suburban road when the sudden shrill ringing of my flip phone shattered the heavy silence inside the cabin. The abrasive sound was incredibly jarring. I reached deep into my breast pocket and quickly retrieved the compact device. The tiny green screen illuminated the darkness, clearly displaying Richard Cole's highly secure private number. Richard was certainly not a man who called back quickly unless something absolutely catastrophic had occurred on his end. I pressed the answer button and brought the plastic speaker to my ear, keeping my eyes glued to the dark road ahead. "Go ahead, Richard," I said, fully expecting to hear comforting confirmation that the absolute lockdown was complete. But the voice on the other end of the line was entirely devoid of its usual confident arrogance. Instead, Richard sounded completely breathless, deeply panicked, and entirely thrown off balance by whatever he had discovered. "Bill, you need to pull over immediately," Richard said, his anxious words coming out in a sharp, urgent rush. "I cannot process what I am looking at right now." My blood ran cold, chilling me far more than the winter air seeping slowly through the rusted floorboards. I did not touch the brake. I kept the heavy truck moving forward at a steady, relentless pace. "I am driving, Richard. Just give me the detailed report. Is the security directive active or not?" A heavy, suffocating silence hung desperately on the line for a terrifying second before he finally answered my demand. "The protocol is completely blocked, Bill. It is entirely paralyzed. I just tried to initiate the asset transfer through the primary secure servers at the main bank, but our administrative credentials have been completely revoked. The central system is flatly rejecting every single authorization code we currently possess." I stared out at the dark road, my mind racing furiously to comprehend the impossible scenario. "That is absolutely impossible, Richard. I am the sole signatory on those designated accounts. No one else has the authority to revoke those credentials." "I hear you, Bill, but the nightmare does not stop there," Richard continued, his voice dropping to a grim, fatalistic register. When the digital transfer utterly failed, I immediately contacted the regional branch manager using our dedicated emergency channel. I ordered a manual lockdown using the physical master documents stored securely in your private vault. "Bill, the safe deposit box is completely empty. It was thoroughly cleaned out exactly 3 months ago. I hit the brakes hard, pulling the heavy truck aggressively onto the shoulder of the empty road. The tires skidded slightly on the loose dirt before coming to a complete and sudden stop. I put the vehicle in park, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "What did you just say to me?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. Richard exhaled a shaky, tired breath over the phone line. The bank manager pulled the physical access logs for the vault. "3 months ago, your son Jason walked into the branch holding a notarized document that granted him full, unrestricted access to the vault. He completely emptied the box. He took the master deeds, the blind trust certificates, and the backup authorization tokens. He took absolutely everything, Bill." Martha turned her head to look at me, her eyes wide with newfound terror. She could clearly sense the shift in the air, the sudden overwhelming gravity of the situation unfolding. "What is it, Bill?" she whispered, her voice fragile. I held up a hand silently, asking her for just a moment. "Richard," I said, trying desperately to steady the rising tide of panic. "A safe deposit box access requires my physical key and a verified biometric signature. Jason could not have bypassed those strict security protocols with just a basic piece of paper. He bypassed it with a special power of attorney," Richard replied, delivering the final devastating blow. "A document explicitly granting him total control over your financial, medical, and legal affairs due to alleged cognitive decline. The document had your verified signature, Bill. It was legally certified, officially stamped, and fully binding." The absolute truth crashed into me with the unstoppable force of a speeding freight train. It was not just a slap. The vile cruelty in the ballroom, the casual dismissal, the fake pregnancy lie in the parking lot. None of it was random arrogance. It was a perfectly executed distraction. Jason and Victoria had not simply married into family wealth. They had orchestrated a hostile takeover of my entire life. They had watched me build my $45 million empire over 40 grueling years. Now they owned it all. I put the truck in drive and pulled back onto the dark suburban road. The realization of their betrayal settled over me not as a frantic panic, but as a heavy, suffocating shroud of absolute clarity. I did not speak another word to Richard on the drive. I simply ended the call and tossed the flip phone onto the dashboard. Beside me, Martha had fallen into an exhausted, troubled sleep, her head resting against the vibrating window. The dark bruise on her cheek was a glaring brand of my failure to protect her. I drove us back to our modest single-story house on the quiet side of town. It was an unassuming property purposefully chosen decades ago to blend in with the working-class neighborhood. No one looking at the cracked driveway or the overgrown oak tree in the front yard would ever suspect that the man living inside held a vast fortune. I parked the truck in the garage and gently lifted Martha into my arms, carrying her fragile frame inside. I walked her to our bedroom, carefully removing her shoes and pulling the thick quilt over her shoulders. She stirred slightly, murmuring something incoherent in her sleep, but she did not wake. I stood by the bed for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest in the dim light. I reached out and softly brushed a stray lock of gray hair away from her bruised face. The tender, loving husband she had known for 40 years carefully tucked her in and kissed her forehead. But the moment I turned my back and stepped out of that bedroom, the loving husband ceased to exist. I walked down the narrow hallway, unbuttoning the cheap flannel shirt and tossing it onto a nearby chair. I reached the end of the corridor and stopped in front of a heavy oak bookshelf. I pressed my thumb against a concealed biometric scanner hidden beneath the bottom shelf. A green light flashed, and the entire structure clicked softly before sliding open to reveal a reinforced steel door. I entered my private home office and locked the vault door firmly behind me. The air inside was cool, kept at a precise temperature to protect the towering racks of encrypted servers humming quietly in the corner. This was the nerve center of my actual life. Outside these walls, I played the role of a retired metal mechanic surviving on a modest pension. Inside, I was the sole architect of a commercial real estate empire that dominated the greater Chicago area. I controlled 14 massive logistics parks, sprawling industrial complexes, and lucrative warehouse facilities that generated millions in passive revenue every single quarter. My total net worth hovered around $45 million, meticulously structured, heavily diversified, and fiercely protected from the volatile fluctuations of the public market. I sat down in the ergonomic leather chair at the center of the room and pressed the power button on the primary console. 3 large high-resolution monitors instantly flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a stark clinical blue glow. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, entering a series of complex alphanumeric passwords to bypass the initial security layers. The system booted up flawlessly, just as I had designed it. I opened the secure communication channel and initiated an encrypted video call with Richard. His face appeared on the center monitor a few seconds later. My attorney looked terrible. His tie was completely undone, his collar was unbuttoned, and his desk was covered in scattered legal files and glowing tablets. He had clearly been working frantically since our brief phone call. "Bill, I have been running continuous diagnostic checks on the primary holding accounts," Richard said, rubbing his tired eyes. "I am trying to find a backdoor entrance or a secondary authorization protocol that we can use to freeze the liquid assets. Have you found anything?" I asked, my voice calm, projecting a terrifying stillness that I always utilized during high-stakes corporate warfare. I watched the data streams cascading across my left monitor, showing the complex web of shell companies and trust accounts I had spent my entire adult life building. Richard shook his head, his expression grim and defeated. "I am hitting a massive wall of encrypted resistance on every single front," he replied. "I instructed the system to initiate a forced override using your biometric data." I tapped the necessary commands into the terminal, watching the progress bar fill up on the screen. The servers hummed louder, processing the immense volume of data required to bypass the standard banking security measures. We waited in tense silence, watching the digital battlefield unfold before our eyes. For a brief moment, the screen flashed green, giving us a fleeting glimmer of hope that the override was successful. But then a series of stark red error messages cascaded rapidly across the display. Access denied. Authorization revoked. Legal hold active. The words blinked mockingly in the center of the monitor. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes at the red text. "What exactly am I looking at, Richard?" I demanded, my hands resting heavily on the smooth surface of the desk. "That is a titanium-grade legal firewall," Richard explained, pointing at his own screen. "Jason did not just empty the physical safe deposit box to steal the master deeds. He took the notarized special power of attorney directly to the central clearinghouse. He legally registered himself as the primary fiduciary of your entire estate. He used that document to completely restructure the digital access hierarchy. We are not dealing with a simple password change. We are dealing with an impenetrable legal barricade. They have successfully locked us out from the inside." I stared at the flashing red letters, the chilling reality sinking deep into my bones. My son possessed the absolute legal authority to dismantle my $45 million empire piece by piece, and currently I was completely powerless to stop him. I refused to accept defeat. I commanded Richard to bypass the primary firewall and dig into the bank's digital archives to retrieve the exact scanned copy of the document Jason had presented. I needed to see this supposed special power of attorney with my own 2 eyes. I needed to understand how a document transferring total control of a $45 million empire could simply manifest out of thin air. Richard's fingers danced across his keyboard. He accessed a secondary portal utilizing a backdoor protocol we had established with the bank's central clearinghouse years ago. The screen flickered and a high-resolution PDF file materialized on my center monitor. I leaned in, scanning the dense legal jargon on the page. It was a flawless, ironclad document. It granted Jason fiduciary control over all my corporate entities and personal accounts. It cited my advancing age and cognitive decline as the trigger for the transfer of power. The sheer audacity of the wording made my stomach turn. But it was the bottom of the page that made the blood freeze in my veins. There, sitting perfectly on the dotted line, was my signature. It was not a digital copy. It was not a clever forgery crafted by a skilled criminal. It was my authentic, undeniable signature, written in the distinctive blue ink of the custom fountain pen I carried every single day. Beside it was the official seal of a licensed notary public. I stared at my own handwriting, the looping letters mocking my invincibility. Richard watched me through the camera, his face pale. "Bill," he said softly. I ran a cross-reference on the seal. "It is a legitimate stamp. The notary is a man named David Vance, an independent contractor who operates out of the downtown financial district. The document is binding." I did not respond. My eyes moved away from the signature toward the top right corner. I looked at the date the document was executed, November the 14th. The moment I registered those specific numbers, the cold, sterile environment of my server room faded away, replaced by the suffocating memory of the worst day of my entire life. 6 months ago, the autumn air was shattered by wailing ambulance sirens. Martha collapsed in our kitchen, clutching the left side of her face. It was a stroke. A terrifying sudden stroke that threatened to tear away the woman who had been my anchor for 4 decades. I remembered the agonizing panic that consumed me as I rode in the ambulance holding her limp hand, praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. When we arrived at the emergency room, the chaos was absolute. Doctors and nurses rushed around us, shouting medical jargon I could barely understand. They needed to move Martha to intensive care immediately to prevent permanent brain damage. That was the moment Jason arrived at the hospital. He rushed through the glass doors wearing a perfectly tailored suit, looking every bit the concerned, devoted son. He hugged me, telling me everything was going to be all right, telling me to focus entirely on Mom while he handled the tedious administrative details. I remembered standing in the glaring fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, my hands shaking, my mind entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of losing my wife. Jason approached me with a heavy wooden clipboard. It was loaded with a massive stack of densely printed papers. He told me it was the hospital admission forms, insurance waivers, and emergency medical consent documents required to get Martha into the specialized ward without delay. "Sign here, Dad," he had said, his voice calm. "Just sign these quickly so they can start the treatment. Do not worry about the fine print. I already read through all the medical jargon for you. Just focus on Mom." I was blinded by fear and overwhelmed by a desperate, agonizing urgency to save the woman I loved. I did not put on my reading glasses. I did not scrutinize the legal clauses. I simply took the blue fountain pen from my pocket and began signing page after page, frantically flipping through the thick stack of papers on the clipboard. I signed medical consents. I signed insurance waivers. And hidden flawlessly deep within that stack of paperwork, I signed the special power of attorney. Jason had orchestrated a cold-blooded heist while his mother was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. He had brought the notary to the hospital waiting room. The notary had stood a few feet away, silently watching me sign the document, under the guise of medical paperwork, officially verifying my identity and my signature, without ever explaining the true nature of the papers I was endorsing. Jason had utilized the most vulnerable, terrifying moment of my entire existence as a calculated distraction. He weaponized my deep, unwavering love for his mother to blind me to his ultimate betrayal. The flashback dissolved, leaving me sitting in the quiet hum of my encrypted server room. I felt a crushing, suffocating weight pressing on my chest. I was not outsmarted by a brilliant corporate raider. I was not defeated by a rival real estate developer. I was exploited by my own flesh and blood. I had literally handed the keys to my $45 million kingdom to the very person who was secretly plotting my total destruction. I slowly raised my head and looked directly into the camera, meeting Richard's worried gaze. "I did not forge this, Richard. I said, my voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the devastating realization of my own foolishness. I signed it. I signed it on the day Martha had her stroke. He hid it inside a stack of emergency hospital admission forms. Richard's eyes widened in profound horror as the malicious reality of Jason's strategy became fully apparent. "That is incredibly vicious," Bill Richard muttered, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "He weaponized a medical emergency to strip you of your assets. That borders on sociopathic behavior." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the digital copy of the document that had effectively erased my entire life's work. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering, completely overriding the initial shock and replacing it with an icy, unyielding resolve. Jason thought he had executed the perfect crime. He believed his clever Trojan horse had secured him absolute, uncontested victory. But he had made one monumental miscalculation. He had left me alive, and he had underestimated the terrifying lengths I would go to in order to protect my wife. Richard and I did not waste another second mourning my past mistakes. I pushed the burning anger down into the deepest, coldest part of my mind and focused entirely on the digital battlefield spread across my monitors. I needed to know exactly what Jason had done with the keys to my kingdom. If he had simply liquidated the assets and moved the massive sums of cash to offshore accounts, the money would be nearly impossible to recover quickly. But commercial real estate is different. You cannot easily hide sprawling industrial parks and logistics centers from the public record. "Richard first," said, my voice sharp and commanding, echoing in the sterile room. "Trace the title deeds right now. Follow the paper trail on every single commercial property listed under the primary holding company. I need to know if he sold them, transferred them to a shell corporation, or if he is currently holding them in a shadow trust." The hands of Richard flew across his keyboard. I watched the dense lines of code and financial records cascading rapidly down the screen. It took him nearly 5 grueling minutes to navigate the complex labyrinth of corporate filings Jason had meticulously constructed. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was incredibly thick with profound disbelief. "He did not sell them, Bill. He did not transfer the deeds to a private buyer. He leveraged them. He used the special power of attorney to pledge your entire commercial portfolio as direct collateral for a massive corporate loan." I leaned much closer to the brightly lit monitor, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted bank records that Richard was forcefully decrypting in real time. The sheer, terrifying scale of the financial maneuver was absolutely staggering. Jason had taken 14 of my most lucrative, high-performing commercial complexes. These were not just empty, undeveloped plots of land. These were fully operational, high-revenue properties that I had spent 40 grueling years acquiring, painstakingly developing, and aggressively managing. He had pledged the massive distribution center located in Oak Brook, the sprawling state-of-the-art technology park in Naperville, and 12 other prime industrial warehouses that formed the very sturdy backbone of my $45 million commercial real estate empire. He had bundled every single one of them together into a single massive corporate portfolio and handed the official title deeds over to a highly aggressive lending institution. I looked at the exact horrifying dollar amount of the legal lien placed against my hard-earned properties. $45 million. He had mercilessly maxed out the financial equity on every single building I rightfully owned. "Who is the exact beneficiary of this massive loan?" I demanded, the icy cold dread finally settling deep into my bones. "Who is holding the financial note on my entire life work?" Richard typed furiously, rapidly pulling up the final authorization documents from the lending institution's secure server. "The sole beneficiary is Novatech," Richard replied, reading the corporate filings aloud. "But the lender is not a traditional banking institution, Bill. The primary underwriter is a venture capital syndicate. The lead investor is Bradley Sterling." The dreaded name echoed ominously in the quiet, steady hum of the encrypted server room. Bradley Sterling. The arrogant, ruthless venture capitalist who had been sitting comfortably at the most prominent VIP table at the lavish wedding reception. The powerful man Jason was so utterly terrified of offending earlier that evening. The missing puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together in my mind with a terrifying, absolute clarity. Jason had always proudly boasted that Novatech was financially valued at $100 million. He paraded around the elite tech world claiming he was a brilliant self-made visionary who had successfully secured a massive Series B funding round purely on the outstanding merit of his software algorithms. It was all a complete, meticulously crafted and utterly fraudulent illusion. Bradley Sterling did not invest $100 million into Novatech because he genuinely believed in my son's extraordinary technological genius. He invested that massive fortune because my son had secretly handed him $45 million in prime, untouchable commercial real estate as a solid personal guarantee. Jason had literally bet my entire existence on the success of his fragile, unproven tech startup. If Novatech flourished, Jason would selfishly reap all the public glory, the immense wealth, and the fame of a tech billionaire. But if Novatech failed, Jason would simply declare corporate bankruptcy and walk away with his personal bank accounts entirely untouched. The cruel and devastating, brutal reality of his elaborate scheme crashed heavily over me. I was the one carrying all the terrible financial risk. I was the silent, unwitting safety net for his reckless corporate gambling. Bradley Sterling was an apex predator in the financial world. He was renowned for aggressively liquidating distressed assets to quickly recover his investments. If Novatech missed a single projected revenue target, if the software failed to launch, or if the company burned through its capital too quickly, Sterling would not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He would immediately execute the strict collateral clauses in the contract. He would seize the Oak Brook Center. He would seize the Naperville Tech Park. He would systematically seize all 14 of my commercial complexes. Everything I had built with my own two hands, every single property I had acquired through decades of sweat, brutal sacrifice, and relentless labor, would be completely wiped out. I would be left with absolutely nothing, stripped of my legacy and thrown into the street in my twilight years. The sprawling empire I had constructed to protect Martha and securely fund our family future was currently dangling over a fatal precipice by a single fragile thread. My son had not just stolen my money. He had stolen my past, my present, and my entire future, and he had callously placed it all on the roulette table for a mere chance at personal glory and endless wealth. The theft was absolute. I sat in the chilling silence of my server room, letting the crushing reality of that absolute theft wash over me. But I did not allow myself to break. I am a man who spent his life turning disastrous investments into highly profitable triumphs. I knew every contract, no matter how flawlessly drafted, contains a fatal flaw. Commercial real estate law in Illinois is incredibly rigid, especially regarding leveraging assets acquired during marriage. Jason could not simply pledge my properties without jumping through massive legal hoops. He needed more than the special power of attorney to hand my empire over. Richard, I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the cooling fans. Pull up the collateral agreements Jason submitted to the venture capital syndicate. I need to see the paperwork he used to bypass marital property laws. Illinois requires spousal consent to leverage joint assets of this magnitude. Did he manage to forge a secondary power of attorney for Martha? Richard immediately began typing. Give me a minute, Bill, he replied. I am looking at the underwriting package now. The venture capital legal team demanded absolute compliance before releasing the $100 million. Here it is. The document you are looking for is called a spousal waiver and consent form. It is a standard legal requirement acknowledging the spouse agrees to the encumbrance of the shared marital estate. Richard transmitted the file to my primary screen. The document materialized before my eyes. It was a standard corporate form releasing the venture capital firm from any future liability regarding marital assets. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page, my eyes searching for the signature block. There, sitting starkly on the white background, was the name of my wife. It was signed in a delicate looping script. At first glance, it looked remarkably like Martha's handwriting. It had the same characteristic curve on the letter M she used since we were high school sweethearts. Jason clearly spent hours perfecting the forgery so no banking clerk would question its authenticity. Next to her forged name was the official stamp of the exact same notary public who certified my special power of attorney. I stared at the fraudulent signature, feeling a fresh wave of visceral disgust for the boy I had raised. But then my eyes drifted upward to the top right corner of the page to check the execution date. The date stamped on the document was November the 17th. I leaned closer to the monitor, staring at those specific numbers until they burned into my retinas. November the 17th. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I let out a sharp, breathless sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Are you seeing this, Richard?" I asked, my voice trembling with a sudden surge of adrenaline. "Do you see the exact date on this document?" "Yes," Richard replied, sounding slightly confused by my sudden change in demeanor. "November the 17th. Why? What is significant about that specific date?" I slammed my fist onto the heavy wooden desk, the impact echoing sharply in the confined space. "Martha had her stroke on November the 14th. I said the words rushing out in a triumphant wave. I rushed her to the emergency room that very morning. Her brain was swelling dangerously. The doctors had to intervene immediately. On the evening of the 14th, they placed my wife into a medically induced coma to allow the swelling to subside. She remained completely unconscious, breathing through a ventilator in the intensive care unit for 8 full days. She did not wake up until November the 22nd. I looked back at the screen, a fierce smile spreading across my face. On November the 17th, the day this legal document was supposedly signed and notarized in a corporate office, Martha was lying in a hospital bed, entirely unresponsive to the world. Richard let out a gasp of sheer disbelief. "That makes the signature a blatant, undeniable forgery," he said, his voice rising with intense excitement. "The notary public is entirely compromised. This single document completely invalidates the entire collateral agreement. The venture capital firm failed to secure a legitimate spousal waiver. Under the law, they have absolutely no valid legal claim to your properties. Bill, you have the silver bullet. We can destroy the financial structure Jason built. We can completely void the massive lien against your real estate empire." I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders. I finally had the ultimate weapon to sever the noose Jason tied around my neck. I had the legal power to instantly pull my $45 million out from under his fragile tech startup. But just as the sweet taste of absolute victory began to settle in my mind, Richard suddenly stopped talking. The energetic clacking of his keyboard ceased. The sudden silence from his end of the connection was incredibly unsettling. "Richard?" I prompted, noticing the sudden shift in his posture. He was leaning so close to his monitor, his nose was nearly touching the screen. His face had drained of color, replacing the triumphant excitement with profound confusion and mounting dread. "Bill, we have a massive problem," Richard whispered, his eyes frantically darting across the data streams. "I just gained access to the primary ledger for Novatech to see where the venture capital funds were distributed. The $100 million from Bradley Sterling was deposited into the corporate account 3 weeks ago. But the money is not there anymore. It is not being used to fund software development or hire engineers. The accounts have been aggressively drained." I watched Richard swallow hard before he delivered the final terrifying piece of the puzzle. "There is a massive anomaly in the financial routing. The funds are being systematically wired out of the country. Jason is bleeding the startup completely dry." I stared at the blinking cursor on my monitor, the chilling echo of Richard's words hanging heavily in the cold air of the server room. The $100 million of venture capital funding was vanishing. I instructed Richard to project the live ledger directly onto my primary screen. I needed to see the financial hemorrhage with my own eyes. The data materialized instantly. Row after row of massive wire transfers scrolled down the display, detailing millions of dollars bleeding out of Novatech's corporate accounts. These were not standard operational expenses. There were no payroll distributions, no software licensing fees, and absolutely no payments to engineering contractors. Instead, I saw massive irregular lump sums being routed through a dizzying maze of intermediary banks. $2 million here, $5 million there. The velocity of the embezzlement was staggering. Executing with the desperate urgency of a smash-and-grab robbery, Jason was not building a legitimate technology company. He was using Bradley Sterling's money as his own personal piggy bank, draining the corporate reserves faster than anyone could possibly track. I felt a twisted mixture of fury and pity for the son I had raised. He had leveraged my entire life's work to secure this massive fortune, and now he was criminally embezzling the funds right out from under the nose of one of the most ruthless venture capitalists in the country. It was financial suicide. He was building a house of cards on a foundation of gasoline. Richard Wong, I said, maintaining my icy composure despite the rising tide of adrenaline. Track the final destination of those wire transfers. Do not let the money get lost in the intermediary banks. Follow the exact routing numbers all the way to the end of the line. I want to know exactly where my son is burying his stolen millions. The mechanical clacking of Richard's keyboard echoed sharply through the secure communication channel. He deployed a specialized tracing algorithm we usually reserved for unmasking hostile corporate takeovers. The software systematically peeled back the layers of financial obfuscation, tracking the digital footprints across multiple international borders. I watched the progress bar inch forward, my patience wearing dangerously thin. Finally, the tracing software locked onto the terminal destination. The funds are bypassing traditional European tax havens, Richard announced, his eyes darting across his monitor. They are terminating in a highly obscure offshore banking institution located in the Cayman Islands. The accounts are registered to a private holding corporation named V&J Enterprises. I narrowed my eyes at the generic corporate title. V&J Enterprises, Victoria and Jason. It was a painfully arrogant and transparent naming convention for a criminal shell company. They believed they were completely untouchable, hiding their stolen wealth behind a thin veil of offshore anonymity, while the ticking time bomb of the venture capital audit drew closer every single day. I needed to see the incorporation documents to legally tie Jason to the embezzled funds. Pull the corporate registry for V&J Enterprises, I commanded, leaning so close to the screen I could almost feel the static electricity. Find the listed directors and the primary account signatories. I want absolute proof that Jason is the sole beneficiary of these offshore accounts before we take this information to the authorities. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. Bill, the Cayman Islands maintain incredibly strict privacy laws regarding corporate registries. It will take time to bypass their security firewalls without triggering an automatic alarm. I do not care about triggering alarms, I snapped, the remnants of my patience completely evaporating. Break the firewall right now. We do not have the luxury of time. Richard nodded grimly and launched a brute force decryption protocol. I watched the encrypted data packets unraveling in real time, revealing the deeply hidden administrative records of the shell company. I fully expected to see my son's name plastered across the documents, confirming his role as the arrogant mastermind behind this massive financial fraud. I braced myself for the final, undeniable proof of his total moral corruption. The decrypted file suddenly populated my center monitor. The official certificate of incorporation for the offshore holding company sat plainly before me. I scanned the list of registered officers, my eyes jumping straight to the line designating the primary controlling director of the vast stolen fortune. But the name printed on the digital document did not belong to my son. I blinked, leaning back in my heavy leather chair as a profound wave of shock washed over me. I read the name a second time, and then a third, making sure the glaring blue light of the monitor was not playing tricks on my tired eyes. The sole director of the offshore holding company was a man named Arthur Vance. I stared at the name, a chilling realization slowly creeping into my mind. I knew exactly who Arthur Vance was. I had paid for a highly detailed background check on Victoria when she first started dating my son. Arthur Vance was Victoria's former boyfriend, a slick, manipulative opportunist she claimed she had completely cut ties with years ago. I sat in stunning silence, connecting the terrifying dots. Jason was not the mastermind. Jason was not the one orchestrating the offshore wire transfers. Jason had absolutely no idea where the venture capital money was actually going. He was nothing but a gullible, useful idiot. Victoria had used him to steal my $45 million commercial real estate portfolio, used that collateral to secure a $100 million investment, and was now systematically bleeding his company dry alongside her former lover. He was the perfect, clueless pawn in his own wife's treacherous game. He remained completely unaware that the merciless steel blade of the financial guillotine was already falling rapidly downward toward his incredibly exposed, highly vulnerable neck, ready to sever his future, while the woman he loved walked away with absolute power and the stolen fortune of his own father. I sat in the glow of the monitors. My son was a blind pawn, marching toward his slaughter, unaware his wife held the knife to his throat. Anger is a luxury the powerless afford. I had to remain cold. Richard broke the heavy silence. Bill, we have to call the police right now. We need to contact the Financial Crimes Unit and report the embezzlement before she drains the funds. We can have them arrested before sunrise. I shook my head slowly, staring at the screen. No, Richard. I replied, my voice dangerously calm. We are not calling the police. Richard looked at me as if I had lost my mind. Bill, they are stealing millions. They committed wire fraud. If we do not report this immediately, you could be implicated. I leaned forward. Listen carefully, Richard. If we call the police now, they will launch a massive criminal investigation. The moment the authorities realize my $45 million real estate portfolio is tied up as collateral, they will freeze everything. Every single property I own will be seized as evidence. Do you know how long a federal fraud investigation takes to unravel? It takes years. My assets would be frozen for a decade. I could not collect rent or service my debts. The empire I spent 40 years building would bleed to death in administrative limbo. I will not allow the government to destroy my work to punish my idiotic son and his wife. We need a surgical strike. We need to uncouple my properties from the deal before authorities get involved. Richard swallowed hard, processing my logic. You are right, he admitted softly. An active criminal investigation would completely paralyze your assets. But how do we uncouple the collateral without triggering an alarm? We use the fatal flaw, I said, pointing at the fraudulent document. We use the spousal waiver. Martha was in a medically induced coma on the exact date that document was signed and notarized. That is not just forgery. That is medical fraud and elder abuse. If we get a judge to officially invalidate that specific document, the entire collateral agreement collapses instantly. Bradley Sterling's firm will lose their legal claim, and my assets will be safe. Richard nodded, typing across his keyboard. We need an emergency ex parte injunction, he said rapidly. An immediate court order issued without notifying the other party, based on overwhelming evidence of imminent harm. But Bill, getting a judge to review an injunction at 2 a.m. is nearly impossible. It is impossible for most people, I replied, my voice thick with absolute determination. But we are not most people. Call Judge Thomas Mitchell. Richard stopped typing and looked at me through the camera. The district judge. Yes, I confirmed. Thomas Mitchell and I served on the city zoning board together 20 years ago. Before he put on the black robe, he was an honorable man who despised corporate predators. He knows my character. He knows I would never wake him up in the night unless lives were on the line. Call his private emergency number. Tell him I have proof of medical fraud and am about to lose my life savings. He will definitely listen. Richard picked up his phone and dialed the secure number. I waited in the quiet hum of my server room, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. 10 minutes later, my center monitor flickered. A highly secure video conference link was established. The screen resolved to show the face of Judge Thomas Mitchell. He was sitting in his home study wearing a bathrobe over his pajamas, his silver hair slightly disheveled. He looked tired, but his intelligent eyes were completely alert. "Bill," the judge said, his deep voice carrying a familiar, comforting weight. "Richard told me this was a matter of absolute life and death. You have exactly 5 minutes to show me why I am awake." I did not waste his time with emotional pleas. I presented the cold facts. Richard transmitted the forged spousal waiver directly to the judge's terminal. Then we transmitted the certified hospital records from November the 17th. The records clearly detailed Martha's critical condition, the administration of sedatives, and the undeniable fact that she was breathing through a ventilator in the intensive care unit on the very day she supposedly signed the legal waiver. Judge Mitchell reviewed the documents in absolute silence. I watched his expression shift from sleepy irritation to profound disgust. He understood the implications immediately. He saw the sheer cruelty of a son using his mother's critical medical emergency as a smokescreen to steal a massive fortune. "This is abhorrent," Judge Mitchell whispered, his voice vibrating with judicial fury. "This is one of the most disgusting abuses of trust I have seen in my entire career on the bench. Your son and his notary orchestrated a predatory fraud while your wife was fighting for her life. I need the waiver voided." "Thomas," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, "if that document stands for one more day, the venture capital firm will seize my entire portfolio when this tech startup inevitably collapses. I need to protect Martha." "You have it," the judge said without a single second of hesitation. "Based on the irrefutable medical evidence presented, I am granting an immediate emergency ex parte injunction. The spousal waiver is hereby declared entirely null and void due to severe medical and notary fraud. The underlying collateral agreement encumbering your commercial properties is legally severed. I am signing the electronic order right now." The digital seal appeared on my screen a moment later. The legal weapon was finally forged. The fraudulent waiver was officially dead. I had successfully severed the noose from around my neck. But the long night was far from over. I looked at Richard through the monitor, the digital injunction glowing brightly before us. Now we have to perfectly execute the financial freeze before the sun completely comes up. The digital ink on Judge Thomas Mitchell's final electronic signature was barely dry before we initiated the next critical phase of our highly destructive counterattack. I stared at the glowing document on my large monitor, feeling a profound sense of validation, but there was absolutely no time to celebrate this preliminary victory. A legal injunction is nothing more than a theoretical shield until it is properly executed and recognized by the financial institutions holding the leverage. If the sun rose and the banks opened for regular business operations before we served the court order, Bradley Sterling's aggressive legal team could potentially find a procedural loophole to delay the vital asset release. We had to strike swiftly in the dead of night, utilizing the automated clearing systems to ensure the freeze was absolute and irreversible. Richard I commanded, my voice slicing through the quiet hum of the server room. "Route the certified injunction directly to the primary compliance division of Bradley Sterling's lead banking partner. Do not send it through standard legal channels. Bypass the junior executives and serve it straight into their automated risk management portal. I want their master ledger to reflect the massive loss of collateral before any of their human analysts even pour their morning coffee." Richard nodded, his fingers dancing across the illuminated keyboard with practiced precision. He was a master of exploiting the bureaucratic rigidity of modern financial institutions. He accessed the highly secure interbank communication network, a heavily fortified digital highway reserved strictly for verified legal mandates and high-level institutional transfers. I watched the progress bar on my secondary monitor as he uploaded the heavily encrypted court order. The document contained the explicit command from a sitting district judge declaring the spousal waiver entirely void and demanding the immediate uncoupling of my 14 commercial properties from Novatech's corporate liability profile. The digital packet flew across the secure network, seeking the central servers of the massive venture capital fund. We sat in tense silence, the only sound in the room being the rhythmic whirring of the cooling fans. In the world of high finance, collateral is the absolute foundation of every single transaction. Venture capital firms utilize complex algorithms to constantly monitor the health of their massive investments. If a foundational asset suddenly disappears from the ledger, the automated systems react with ruthless efficiency to protect the firm from exposure. We were counting on that cold, mechanical paranoia to execute our strike. Suddenly, the screen blinked rapidly. The transmission sequence confirmed successful delivery. The court order had breached their system. "Now we wait for the heavy dominoes to finally fall," Richard whispered, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his exhausted eyes. It should only take a few minutes for their risk assessment software to process the incoming judicial mandate and initiate a catastrophic margin call. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on the scrolling data streams, watching the interconnected financial web tremble under the weight of our legal strike. We had tapped into the public corporate registry to monitor Novatech's visible financial status in real time. 5 agonizing minutes passed. Then 10. The agonizing wait felt like an eternity. Just as a shadow of doubt began to creep into my mind, the screen erupted in a flurry of stark red alerts. The automated compliance system at Bradley Sterling's bank had fully digested the judge's undeniable decree. The reaction was spectacularly violent. The system recognized that the $45 million of premium commercial real estate backing the massive tech investment was suddenly gone, completely vaporized by the stroke of a judicial pen. Without that solid foundational collateral, Novatech was immediately flagged as an incredibly toxic, unsecured liability. The venture capital bank executed its automated self-defense protocols without a shred of human hesitation. The digital locks slammed completely shut. I watched the screen as the primary operational accounts for Novatech were instantly frozen. The remaining balance of the initial investment round was completely paralyzed, legally quarantined by the banking institution to mitigate their massive sudden exposure. The credit lines associated with my son's startup were immediately revoked. The corporate credit cards, the operational slush funds, and the massive payroll accounts were all permanently severed in a fraction of a second. Novatech went from being a celebrated, highly funded darling of the tech industry to a financially paralyzed shell company in the blink of an eye. The entire startup was effectively bankrupt, completely starved of the essential capital it needed to survive another single day. "It is done, Bill," Richard said, his voice carrying a mixture of profound awe and deep exhaustion. "The massive collateral lien has been officially and permanently erased from your commercial portfolio. Your 14 properties are completely safe, unencumbered, and entirely back under your exclusive control. Bradley Sterling's venture capital firm has locked down Novatech's remaining assets to stop the bleeding. The company is completely dead in the freezing water. They cannot move a single cent." I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, letting the tremendous wave of relief wash over me. The empire I had spent 4 decades building was finally safe. I had successfully snatched my legacy back from the jaws of absolute ruin. I looked at the digital clock glowing in the corner of the monitor. It was nearly 3 in the morning. Somewhere across the city in a luxurious bridal suite or a lavish hotel room, Jason was likely sleeping soundly next to the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. He was completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial apocalypse that had just obliterated his entire world. He went to sleep believing he was a powerful, untouchable tech billionaire who had successfully manipulated his clueless old parents. He had absolutely no idea that he would wake up to find his company bankrupt, his investors panicked, and his entire life completely destroyed. The foundation of his incredible arrogance had been entirely eradicated in the dark, all without him ever knowing I was the one holding the match. The immediate threat to my commercial real estate portfolio was permanently neutralized, but the overarching war was far from won. The $45 million foundation of my empire was secure, but the reality remained that my son's wife had successfully embezzled $12 million of Bradley Sterling's venture capital. That massive sum was currently sitting in an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, under the control of Victoria and her former lover, Arthur Vance. If we did not act decisively, she would flee the country before sunrise, leaving Jason to face the catastrophic fallout of a collapsed tech startup and a massive federal fraud investigation. My son was a fool, a coward, and a traitor to his own blood, but I refused to let Victoria use him as a convenient scapegoat while she escaped with the stolen millions. I needed to drop the hammer on her, and I needed to do it with overwhelming, inescapable force. Local law enforcement was entirely inadequate for a financial crime of this magnitude and complexity. If I called the Chicago police, they would spend days fumbling through jurisdictional red tape and trying to understand the intricate offshore wire transfers. By the time they secured a basic warrant, Victoria would be sipping cocktails on a beach in a country with no extradition treaty. I needed the apex predators of the financial justice system. I needed federal intervention. Richard Wall, I said, maintaining my icy resolve. We are escalating this directly to the federal level. Get me Special Agent Thomas Vance on the secure line. Right now. Richard paused for a fraction of a second, his hands hovering over his illuminated keyboard. Agent Vance from the White Collar Crime Division bill, involving the FBI, guarantees a public spectacle. The fallout for Novatech and Jason will be absolutely devastating and completely irreversible. The fallout is already inevitable, Richard, which replied coldly. Jason made his bed when he forged my signature. Now he has to lie in it. But I will be damned if I let Victoria walk away with that stolen money while she leaves my son to face the firing squad alone. Get me Vance. I had known Thomas Vance for nearly 15 years. We had crossed paths during a complex, multi-state real estate acquisition that had inadvertently entangled one of my properties with a federal racketeering investigation. I had cooperated fully, providing his team with the necessary documentation to dismantle a massive money laundering operation. Agent Vance respected my absolute discretion and my profound understanding of corporate financial structures. He knew I was not a man who cried wolf, and he knew I did not waste his time with petty disputes. The secure video link connected, and the stern, unyielding face of Special Agent Thomas Vance appeared on my monitor. He was sitting in a sterile, brightly lit office at the local FBI field headquarters, nursing a cup of black coffee. He did not look surprised to receive a secure video call at 3 a.m. In his line of work, the most critical intelligence often arrived in the dead of night. Bill Agent Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Richard's emergency alert flagged this as a Priority 1 wire fraud situation with imminent flight risk. You have exactly 2 minutes to convince me to wake up a federal magistrate for an arrest warrant. I did not waste a single second with pleasantries or emotional context. I delivered a precise surgical summary of the massive financial crime unfolding in real time. I detailed the $100 million venture capital injection into Novatech, the fraudulent collateralization of my commercial real estate portfolio, and the subsequent rapid embezzlement of $12 million into the Cayman Islands shell company, controlled by Victoria and Arthur. As I spoke, Richard simultaneously transmitted the encrypted data packets directly to Vance's secure terminal. He sent the forged spousal waiver, the verified hospital records proving the medical fraud, the detailed logs of the offshore wire transfers, and the decrypted corporate registry documents definitively linking Victoria and Arthur to the stolen funds. Agent Vance reviewed the incoming data streams with chilling efficiency. I watched his eyes dart rapidly across his screen, his jaw tightening as the sheer scale and audacity of the crime became apparent. This is incredibly sloppy work on their part, Vance muttered, shaking his head slightly. They moved massive sums of capital too quickly, tripping multiple federal reporting thresholds. But the offshore routing through the Caymans complicates the immediate asset recovery. I don't care about the immediate asset recovery right now, Tom, I stated firmly. I care about stopping the primary suspect before she disappears. Victoria Harrison is currently at a wedding reception at the Palmer House Hilton in downtown Chicago. Given the sudden catastrophic freeze on Novatech's primary accounts that we initiated 20 minutes ago, it is highly probable she will receive an automated alert from her banking apps. Once she realizes the venture capital funds are paralyzed and the collateral is gone, she will know the entire scheme has collapsed. She will run, and she will run tonight. Agent Vance leaned back in his chair, processing the tactical situation. "You want us to intercept her at the wedding venue," he said, his tone confirming he understood the precise objective. "You want a public takedown to ensure she cannot leverage her social connections or her husband's remaining resources to facilitate an escape." "Exactly," I replied. "She needs to be neutralized immediately before she can access a private jet or transfer the stolen funds to an untraceable crypto wallet." Vance nodded sharply, his decision made. He reached for a red phone on his desk, a direct line to the tactical dispatch unit. "Bill, based on the irrefutable documentary evidence your team just provided, we have more than enough probable cause to execute an emergency apprehension for massive wire fraud and grand larceny. I am mobilizing a rapid response team to the Palmer House Hilton right now. We will secure all exits and apprehend Victoria Harrison before she can leave the premises." "Thank you, Tom," I said softly. "Do not thank me yet, Bill," Vance warned, his eyes locking onto mine through the camera. "Your son Jason is the chief executive officer of the company that received the initial funds. He is going to be swept up in this investigation. He will face intense scrutiny and potentially severe federal charges depending on his level of complicity in the underlying fraud. Are you prepared for the total destruction of your son's life?" I looked at the black screen for a long moment after the call ended. Was I prepared? No father is ever truly prepared to watch his son fall. But Jason had chosen his path. He had chosen the arrogant, cruel woman over the mother who sacrificed everything for him. He had chosen the illusion of power over the reality of family. I had simply removed the safety net he had so callously taken for granted. The trap was set. The federal authorities were moving. It was time for me to return to the wedding and watch the house of cards finally collapse. I closed the encrypted connection with a heavy, definitive keystroke. The brilliant blue light of the 3 massive monitors faded into absolute blackness, plunging the subterranean server room into a deep, echoing silence. I sat in the darkness for a long moment, letting the rhythmic hum of the cooling fans wash over me. The adrenaline that had fueled my frantic digital warfare was slowly beginning to ebb, leaving behind a sharp, profound clarity. I had just dismantled the entire existence of my only son. I had summoned the full, crushing weight of the federal justice system down upon the woman he foolishly chose to marry. There was no turning back now. The gears of retribution were already turning, grinding forward with a merciless mechanical precision. I pushed myself up from the heavy leather chair, feeling a dull ache in my lower back, a quiet reminder of my 70 years of life. But my mind was sharper than it had been in over a decade. I unlocked the reinforced steel door and stepped back out into the quiet hallway of my modest suburban home. The air felt different now. The suffocating tension that had gripped me since the moment Victoria slapped Martha was completely gone. In its place was a cold, unwavering resolve. I walked softly down the corridor and paused just outside our master bedroom. I gently pushed the door open an inch. The room was bathed in the pale, silvery light of the moon filtering through the curtains. Martha was still sleeping soundly under the thick quilt. Her breathing was deep and rhythmic. The dark purple bruise on her cheek was barely visible in the shadows, but its presence burned in my memory. I watched her for a few minutes, drawing immense strength from her quiet peace. I was doing this for her. I was protecting the woman who had stood by my side when we had absolutely nothing. I silently pulled the door shut and walked toward the guest bedroom at the far end of the hall. Inside the guest room stood a large antique cedar wardrobe that I had not opened in over 5 years. I stepped in front of it and unbuttoned my faded checkered flannel shirt. I pulled it off my shoulders and tossed it carelessly onto the floor. I kicked off my scuffed work boots and stepped out of my cheap denim jeans. I stripped away the pathetic, shabby disguise of the clueless, defeated old mechanic that I had worn so convincingly for Jason and his arrogant wife. That harmless old man was dead. He had died the second the hand of Victoria struck the face of my wife. I reached for the brass handle of the cedar wardrobe and pulled the heavy doors open. The rich, woody scent filled the room. Hanging inside, carefully preserved under breathable garment bags, was my armor. These were the clothes I used to wear when I walked into hostile boardrooms and dismantled rival real estate syndicates. I reached past the casual jackets and pulled out a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. It was crafted by a master tailor in Milan, cut from the finest, most resilient wool designed to project absolute authority and uncompromising power. I dressed slowly, deliberately, feeling the psychological shift with every button I fastened. The crisp, heavily starched white dress shirt fit perfectly across my shoulders. I pulled the dark gray trousers up and fastened the subtle, genuine leather belt. I slipped my arms into the perfectly tailored jacket, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the structured fabric settling against my frame. I walked over to a small mahogany valet stand and opened the top velvet drawer. I bypassed the cheap plastic wristwatch Jason had bought me for Christmas. Instead, I retrieved a heavy platinum luxury timepiece fastening the cool metal clasp around my wrist. I slid a pair of understated solid white gold cufflinks into my French cuffs. Finally, I stepped into a pair of immaculate hand-polished black Oxford shoes that gleamed like dark mirrors. I turned and faced the full-length mirror standing in the corner of the room. The man looking back at me was a complete stranger to the wealthy venture capitalists celebrating downtown. The stooped, shuffling posture of the blue-collar pensioner was completely gone. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, my chest broad. The charcoal suit draped flawlessly over my frame, radiating a quiet, terrifying elegance. My silver hair was neatly combed back, and the deep lines on my face no longer looked like the markers of exhaustion. They looked like the scars of a veteran apex predator who had survived 1,000 corporate wars. This was the true William Harrison. This was the ruthless, calculating titan who had quietly built a $45 million empire from nothing but dirt and concrete. I adjusted my cuffs one last time, my eyes cold and empty of mercy. Jason had desperately wanted to hide me because he thought I was an embarrassing peasant. I was about to show him exactly what genuine, terrifying wealth truly looked like. I grabbed the keys to my vehicle and walked out to the garage. I ignored the rusted pickup truck sitting in the driveway. I pressed a hidden button on the wall, opening a secondary climate-controlled bay at the back of the garage. Inside sat a pristine midnight black luxury sedan. It was a vehicle of silent, understated power. I slid into the luxurious leather driver's seat and pushed the ignition button. The massive engine purred to life with a deep, menacing growl. I backed the sleek sedan out of the garage and turned onto the empty suburban street. The digital clock on the dashboard read 3:15 in the morning. The city was perfectly quiet. I drove smoothly and effortlessly, navigating the winding roads that led toward the towering skyline of the downtown financial district. The trap was fully set, and I was finally coming back. The tires of the midnight black sedan glided silently over the smooth pavement as I entered the heart of downtown Chicago. The towering skyscrapers loomed above me, casting long geometric shadows across the deserted streets. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the Palmer House Hilton. The massive brass doors gleamed under the warm glow of the exterior lighting. A young valet attendant rushed forward, expecting to open the door for a late-arriving wealthy executive. He stopped short when he saw my face, recognizing the old man he had previously directed to the hidden overflow lot hours ago. His eyes widened as he took in the flawless charcoal suit, the platinum watch, and the undeniable aura of authority radiating from my posture. I did not offer him a warm, grandfatherly smile. I simply handed him the heavy key fob and stepped away from the vehicle. The crisp night air felt invigorating against my face. Waiting for me, in the shadowy alcove near the main entrance, were two men dressed in sharp, unremarkable dark suits. They stood with a rigid, disciplined posture that immediately identified them to anyone who knew what to look for. These were the federal agents Thomas Vance had dispatched. I approached them with a steady, unhurried stride. The taller agent stepped forward and offered a brief, professional nod. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we have secured the perimeter. We have agents stationed at the loading docks, the service elevators, and the subterranean parking garage. Nobody is leaving this building without our explicit permission." I thanked him quietly. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored shirt one final time. We walked together through the opulent lobby of the historic hotel. Our footsteps echoed in perfect, terrifying unison against the polished marble floor. We moved past the decorative fountains and the intricate velvet tapestries, ascending the sweeping grand staircase that led directly to the primary ballroom. The muffled sound of polite laughter and clinking crystal glasses grew louder with every step we took. They were celebrating a massive triumph, entirely unaware that the foundation of their newly acquired empire had already been reduced to absolute ash. I stopped directly in front of the towering double doors of the reception hall. The two federal agents flanked me, positioning themselves on either side with cold, absolute readiness. I placed my hands on the heavy brass handles. I did not push the doors open aggressively or violently. I pushed them open with a slow, deliberate force, stepping over the threshold and entering the grand ballroom. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly triumphant. The string quartet had been replaced by a subtle ambient jazz melody playing softly through the hidden speakers. The room was bathed in a warm golden illumination. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos drifted silently among the tables, pouring expensive vintage champagne into delicate crystal flutes. At the far end of this cavernous room, standing on a raised illuminated stage, was my son. Jason was holding a wireless microphone bathed in a brilliant spotlight. He was in the middle of delivering his grand celebratory toast. Beside him stood Victoria, her previously pristine designer gown, now completely clean and flawless, her face arranged in a perfect, adoring smile. Jason swept his free hand across the room, addressing the audience of venture capitalists, startup founders, and elite corporate investors. "We built Novatech from absolutely nothing," Jason proclaimed, his voice booming with artificial humility and practiced charisma. "We started with nothing but a bold vision and a relentless, unwavering work ethic. We did not have deep pockets or legacy wealth to fall back on. We relied on pure innovation, late nights, and the incredible support of the brilliant team sitting in this very room tonight." I walked slowly down the center aisle, moving like a phantom through the sea of opulence. My heavy Oxford shoes made no sound against the thick, luxurious carpet. I listened to my son blatantly lie to the most powerful financial predators in the Midwest. He spun a magnificent fictitious tale of a self-made technology genius who had conquered the modern world through sheer intellect. He deliberately erased the decades of grueling manual labor I had endured to provide his safety net. He conveniently omitted the $45 million commercial real estate portfolio he had fraudulently stolen just to secure his seat on that elevated stage. He stood under the bright lights, soaking in the admiration of billionaires, completely oblivious to the Reaper methodically walking down the center aisle toward him. The guests seated at the tables near the entrance were the first to notice the sudden chilling shift in the atmosphere. They felt the cold, heavy presence of the federal agents flanking my citizens. Conversations began to taper off, dying out in a cascading wave of uneasy silence. Heads slowly turned. The wealthy investors, trained to detect shifts in power dynamics, immediately recognized that the man walking toward the stage was not the shabby, clueless peasant who had been humiliated and discarded earlier that evening. They saw a titan entering his rightful domain. The ripple of silence moved steadily toward the front of the room, table by table, until the ambient jazz music seemed inappropriately loud in the vacuum. Jason was entirely consumed by the sound of his own echoing voice. He continued to speak, oblivious to the fact that his wealthy audience was no longer looking at him. Their eyes were fixed on the slow, deliberate approach of the uninvited guest. I maintained my steady pace, refusing to break my terrifying, calculated stride. I reached the first row of VIP tables and stopped directly in front of the elevated wooden stage. The ambient music abruptly halted, as the hired sound technician noticed the severe disturbance. Jason finally lowered his hands and looked down from his brightly illuminated pedestal. He stared at me, his false smile faltering. The moment of absolute reckoning had finally arrived, and the trap was closing tight. I did not wait for Jason to recover his composure. I placed my leather shoe onto the first wooden step of the stage and began my ascent. The wooden stairs groaned softly under my weight, the only sound breaking the heavy silence of the massive ballroom. I kept my posture rigidly upright, my eyes locked dead ahead. Jason stared down at me, his handsome features contorting through conflicting emotions. First came profound confusion, his brain struggling to reconcile the presence of his discarded father with the sharp figure invading his sanctuary. Then came a flash of deep embarrassment. Finally, as my steady footsteps brought me closer to the glowing platform, the embarrassment curdled into naked panic. "Dad, what the hell are you doing here?" Jason hissed, pulling the wireless microphone away from his mouth and pressing it tightly against his chest. "I told you to go home. You are ruining my presentation. Get off this stage right now before I have you physically removed." I ignored his whispering. I continued walking my stride, unbroken stepping fully into the blinding glare of the theatrical spotlight. The intense heat of the overhead lamps washed over my shoulders, illuminating the immaculate cut of my charcoal gray suit. Jason instinctively took a half step backward, unnerved by my cold demeanor. His eyes darted wildly toward the perimeter of the room, desperately seeking the security guards he had commanded to escort me out just hours prior. "Security!" Jason shouted, his voice cracking slightly, abandoning any pretense of maintaining his visionary persona. "Guards, please remove this man from the stage immediately. He is trespassing on a private corporate event." Two large men in standard black uniforms broke away from the mahogany walls, rushing forcefully down the side aisles toward the stage. They moved with the aggressive momentum of men paid handsomely to eliminate wealthy people's problems. But before their heavy boots could touch the wooden stairs of the platform, the two federal agents who had flanked my entrance smoothly intercepted them. The taller agent stepped into the aisle, blocking the path with his formidable frame. He did not draw a weapon. He merely reached inside his dark suit jacket and produced a leather credential case, flipping it open to display the unmistakable gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The security guards stopped dead in their tracks, their aggressive momentum evaporating in a single instant. They looked at the federal badge, then at the stern faces of the agents, and immediately stepped back, raising their hands in a gesture of surrender. They retreated to the shadows, wanting nothing to do with whatever catastrophic legal disaster was about to unfold. A collective audible gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests seated at the tables. The venture capitalists and startup founders exchanged deeply troubled glances, their instincts signaling that a massive disruption was occurring right before their eyes. Victoria, standing just a few feet behind Jason, let out a sharp, trembling breath. Her face drained of all color, her hands nervously clutching the cascading fabric of her white bridal gown. Jason looked at his retreating security team, his jaw dropping in absolute paralyzing disbelief. He turned his head back to me, his chest heaving under his tailored jacket. "Dad," he pleaded, his voice now a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Please, I will give you whatever you want. I will buy you a new house. I will write you a check right now. Just please walk away and let me finish my speech. Do not do this to me in front of these people." He extended his free hand, a desperate, hollow gesture of reconciliation from a boy who had sold his soul to the highest bidder. I stopped less than 2 feet away from him, invading his personal space, completely dominating the illuminated stage. I looked into his panicked, pleading eyes. I saw no genuine remorse, only the terrifying realization that he was losing his grip on his fantasy. He was not begging for my forgiveness. He was begging for the preservation of his fraudulent empire. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not blink. I simply reached out with my right hand, moving with a slow, undeniable certainty, and wrapped my fingers firmly around the sleek black casing of the wireless microphone he was clutching against his chest. Jason tried to hold onto it, his knuckles turning white, but his physical resistance was incredibly weak, entirely sapped by his overwhelming fear. I pulled the microphone effortlessly from his trembling grasp, stripping away his voice, his authority, and his platform in one fluid, decisive motion. With the microphone now firmly in my possession, I turned my back on my son. I dismissed his existence entirely, treating him as nothing more than an insignificant shadow standing on a stage he never deserved. I looked out over the vast sea of opulence, my eyes scanning the terrified, silent faces of the corporate elite. I bypassed the mid-level managers, the wealthy socialites, and the eager technology journalists. I searched the front row of the exclusive VIP tables, looking for the specific man whose massive financial leverage had fueled this entire treacherous nightmare. My gaze locked onto him instantly. He was sitting at a large circular table adorned with white roses and crystal glassware, directly in the center of the room. He was an older man, impeccably dressed, with sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was leaning slightly forward, his hands steepled under his chin, watching me with intense, predatory curiosity. He was the apex predator of the Midwest financial ecosystem. He was the man holding the $100 million key to the future of Novatech. I raised the wireless microphone to my lips, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom, and I began to speak directly to Bradley Sterling, the very man who mistakenly believed he now owned the entire commercial empire I had painstakingly built for my family. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice echoing through the massive sound system, carrying absolute clarity to every single corner of the remarkably silent ballroom. "My name is William Harrison. I am the father of the man standing on the stage directly behind me, but far more importantly to you and your partners. I am the sole legitimate owner of the $45 million commercial real estate portfolio that was fraudulently pledged to illegally secure your venture capital fund." I stepped off the wooden stage and began walking slowly toward his highly exclusive table. The vast sea of wealthy investors parted nervously before me, creating a wide, entirely clear path. No one dared to speak a word. No one dared to intervene or block my approach. Bradley Sterling did not move an inch. He remained perfectly still in his chair, his sharp, predatory eyes continuously evaluating me, mathematically calculating the exact level of critical threat I currently posed to his massive financial investment. I stopped directly across from him. I reached inside the deep inner pocket of my tailored jacket and retrieved a thick, neatly folded stack of heavy legal documents. I tossed them forcefully onto the pristine white tablecloth. They landed with a remarkably heavy, definitive thud right next to his crystal champagne flute. "Those are certified copies of an emergency ex parte injunction," I stated firmly, keeping my tone strictly professional, entirely devoid of any useless emotional theatrics. "They were signed and successfully executed mere hours ago by District Judge Thomas Mitchell. The spousal waiver submitted to your diligent underwriting team is an absolutely blatant forgery. My wife, Martha Harrison, was trapped in a medically induced coma, breathing heavily through a mechanical ventilator inside a secure intensive care unit on the exact date that specific document was supposedly notarized. Therefore, the restrictive encumbrance placed on my 14 commercial properties is entirely null and void. I have legally severed my valuable assets from this catastrophic arrangement. You no longer hold any legitimate claim over my life work." Sterling leaned forward slowly. He did not look at Jason. He kept his gaze locked firmly on my face, recognizing the unyielding truth in my posture. He reached out and picked up the thick stack of papers, his eyes scanning the first page. The color began to rapidly drain from his traditionally composed features. His legendary arrogance was melting away, replaced by the sickening realization of a devastating financial exposure. "As of 3 exactly this morning, I continued ensuring every single venture capitalist in the room could accurately hear the devastating reality. The primary compliance division at your lead banking institution recognized the judicial mandate. The automated risk management portal executed a catastrophic margin call. They realized the foundational collateral backing your $100 million investment had completely evaporated. To mitigate their massive exposure, your bank immediately froze every single operational account associated with Novatech. The corporate credit lines are permanently severed. The slush funds are locked. The payroll accounts are paralyzed. Novatech has absolutely zero financial backing left. The company you just toasted to is completely bankrupt. The heavy silence in the room suddenly shattered. A frantic, chaotic wave of whispers and gasps erupted across the grand ballroom. The wealthy investors, the board members, and the elite socialites all began talking at once, the terrifying realization of the massive financial disaster, sending shockwaves through the tightly packed crowd. People were already pulling out their phones, desperately trying to contact their wealth managers and legal teams. Bradley Sterling dropped the legal injunctions back onto the white tablecloth. His face, usually a mask of predatory confidence, was now completely pale and devoid of all color. He finally looked past me, his furious gaze locking onto Jason, who was still standing paralyzed on the stage. Sterling realized he had been played for an absolute fool by a desperate, arrogant boy. He had handed over $100 million based on a phantom safety net. Behind me, a sudden, sharp noise cut through the rising chaos of the panicked crowd. It was a high, terrified sound, sounding exactly like the frantic gasp of a trapped animal. I turned my head just in time to see Victoria. The perfect aristocratic facade she had so meticulously maintained for years had completely shattered in a single instant. The elegant, confident bride was entirely gone. She understood immediately that the frozen bank accounts meant her offshore escape route was closing fast, and the undeniable presence of the federal agents at the main entrance meant the authorities already knew absolutely everything about the missing funds. Victoria dropped her expensive silk bouquet. The delicate flowers scattered haphazardly across the polished wooden stage. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed terribly over the panicked voices of the surrounding investors. She did not look at her husband. She did not try to offer a single excuse to the man she had just married. She simply grabbed the heavy layers of her $15,000 designer wedding gown, furiously hiking the pristine white fabric up far above her knees, and she bolted. She sprinted down the side stairs of the stage, with desperate, frantic energy, violently pushing past the bewildered bridesmaids and rushing blindly toward the rear exit doors of the grand ballroom, desperately hoping to vanish into the cold night before the massive federal trap could permanently snap completely shut around her. The entire carefully constructed illusion of their extravagant wedding reception dissolved into utter madness. Security guards scrambled wildly, unsure whether to protect the panicked guests or apprehend the fleeing bride. I stood perfectly still amidst the swirling pandemonium, my posture unwavering, watching the incredible destruction of the deceitful empire they had arrogantly tried to build upon my stolen legacy. The reckoning I had promised was finally tearing their world apart with flawless, terrifying precision, leaving absolutely nothing behind but the bitter, inescapable truth of their own monumental greed and unforgivable cruelty exposed for the entire world to see. Victoria did not make it far. She scrambled frantically across the polished wooden floorboards of the grand ballroom, her white heels slipping underneath the massive layers of her designer wedding gown. She pushed blindly through terrified bridesmaids, her hands reaching for the brass handles of the rear exit. She believed she could slip away into the dark alleys of downtown Chicago and vanish before the consequences of her greed caught up to her. But she had underestimated the meticulous preparation of Thomas Vance. As Victoria lunged for the doors, they swung open forcefully. 2 federal agents stepped into her path, their dark windbreakers parting to reveal the tactical gear and badges secured to their belts. They did not shout or draw weapons. They simply moved with ruthless efficiency, stepping forward to block her escape. Victoria collided with the lead agent, stumbling backward in shock. Before she could scream, the second agent grabbed her wrist, twisting her arm behind her back with an uncompromising grip. The metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut, echoed sharply, slicing through the chaotic murmurs of the panicked crowd. The bride was instantly reduced to a captured fugitive thrashing uncontrollably as the agents secured her wrists. I turned my gaze away from the pathetic spectacle at the exit and focused my attention on the man still standing, frozen on the elevated wooden stage. Jason was staring at his new wife with his mouth hanging wide open, his eyes hollow with profound, uncomprehending shock. He watched the federal agents escort the thrashing bride toward the main lobby, her pristine dress dragging across the floor, collecting spilled wine and shattered glass. He could not process the reality of the situation. His brain was trying to reconcile the image of his brilliant partner with the handcuffed criminal being dragged away in front of his elite investors. He slowly lowered the microphone to his side and looked down at me, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He thought the FBI was here solely for him. He believed this was my retaliation for the forged documents and the hostile takeover of my commercial portfolio. I walked toward the edge of the stage, my shoes stepping over the discarded flowers from Victoria's ruined bouquet. I looked up at the boy I had raised, feeling no pity for the terror radiating from his trembling frame. "You are going to federal prison, Jason," I said, my voice carrying a quiet certainty that cut through the noise of the stunned ballroom. "The authorities already possess the medical records proving that you forged your mother's signature on the spousal waiver while she was fighting for her life in a coma. They have the notary public in custody. They have the digital footprints of every fraudulent document you submitted to secure this venture capital funding. You committed massive corporate fraud, you endangered my life savings, and you did it all while smiling in my face. You traded your parents for the illusion of power, and now you will pay the ultimate price." Jason dropped to his knees on the hard wooden stage. He gripped the edge of the platform, leaning down toward me, with tears streaming freely down his face. "Dad. Please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "I did not want to hurt you. Victoria told me this was the only way to secure the funding round. She told me we could quietly pay you back from the corporate profits once Novatech became a unicorn. She said you were too old and stubborn to understand the modern tech industry. It was all her idea, Dad. She manipulated me. You have to believe me." I stared at him, feeling a sudden deep wave of absolute disgust. Even now, facing the total destruction of his life, he was desperately trying to pass the blame. He was a coward down to his very core. I leaned closer to the stage, making sure my next words would shatter the last remaining fragment of his pathetic delusions. "You are a fool, Jason," I whispered, my voice dripping with cold, venomous truth. "You think Victoria was trying to build a billion-dollar company with you. You think she pushed you to forge those documents so you could rule the tech world together. She never cared about Novatech, and she never cared about you." Jason stopped crying. He stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. I looked him directly in the eyes, delivering the final blow to his shattered ego. "Before I froze your corporate accounts tonight, your brilliant wife authorized international wire transfers. She systematically drained $12 million of Bradley Sterling's venture capital funding right out from under your nose. She routed every cent right into a heavily encrypted offshore shell company located in the Cayman Islands." Jason gasped, the color draining from his face as the reality of her betrayal hit him. But the true humiliation had not even registered yet. "Do you want to know who is registered as the sole controlling director of that offshore account?" I asked, my voice echoing like a judge reading a death sentence. "It is not you, Jason. It is Arthur Vance." The name struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. Arthur Vance, Victoria's former lover. The slick opportunist she swore she cut out of her life years ago. Jason collapsed backward onto the stage, his hands gripping his hair in agony. The ultimate public humiliation washed over him as the horrible truth settled into his bones. He was not a tech genius. He was not a visionary CEO. He was nothing but a gullible pawn. He had sacrificed his family, destroyed his mother's dignity, and committed federal crimes, all for a woman who was robbing him blind to fund a tropical escape with her ex-boyfriend. He had traded everything that mattered for a lie, and now he was left with absolutely nothing. The crushing reality of his absolute ruin echoed through the cavernous ballroom, drowning out the ambient murmurs of the stunned crowd. Jason remained crumpled on the polished wooden stage, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. He looked like a hollow shell of a man, his carefully constructed tech genius persona entirely evaporated. Below the stage, the atmosphere of the grand reception had shifted from a luxurious celebration into a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. Bradley Sterling, the ruthless venture capitalist who had almost lost $100 million to my son's pathetic shell game, did not simply sit back and watch the drama unfold. He acted with the swift, brutal efficiency that had made him a titan of industry. I watched Sterling raise a single hand, giving a sharp, silent command to his extensive entourage. Instantly, a small army of sharply dressed corporate lawyers and private security contractors sprang into action. They moved with military precision, fanning out across the massive room to secure every single exit. Sterling was not going to allow anyone connected to Novatech to slip away into the night. His team effectively locked down the entire ballroom, turning the opulent wedding venue into a heavily guarded holding cell. The wealthy guests, the startup founders, and the social elite were suddenly trapped inside, forced to witness the catastrophic destruction of the false empire they had just toasted. While Sterling secured the perimeter, the main entrance doors swung wide open once again. The two federal agents who had apprehended Victoria forcefully dragged her back into the grand foyer, pulling her into the harsh, unforgiving light of the ballroom. She was no longer the arrogant, untouchable queen of the evening. Her perfectly coiffed hair was falling in messy, frantic strands across her face. She was struggling wildly against the iron grip of the agents, her wrists pinned awkwardly behind her back. She was shouting desperate, incoherent demands for a lawyer, her voice cracking with pure panic. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting across the sea of shocked faces until they finally landed on the stage. She locked eyes with Jason. That single fleeting moment of eye contact was the spark that ignited a massive powder keg. Jason stared at the woman who had manipulated him into committing federal crimes, forged his mother's signature, and stolen $12 million to run away with her former lover. The profound humiliation and the absolute magnitude of her betrayal shattered whatever fragile remnants of sanity he had left. His despair instantly mutated into a blind, explosive rage. Jason let out a guttural, agonizing scream that tore through his throat. He scrambled off the elevated wooden stage, his polished dress shoes slipping wildly on the scattered flower petals. He did not care about the federal agents. He did not care about the billionaires watching his every move. He only cared about the lying, treacherous woman who had destroyed his entire existence. Jason charged down the center aisle like a rabid animal, his fists clenched tight at his sides. The wealthy guests scrambled backward, knocking over expensive mahogany chairs and shattering crystal centerpieces in their desperate scramble to get out of his path. Victoria let out a piercing shriek of terror as she saw her newlywed husband sprinting directly toward her, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The federal agents shouted commands, stepping forward to intercept the incoming threat. But Jason was moving with the erratic, unpredictable momentum of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He collided violently with the group, using his entire body weight to crash through the defensive line. He tackled Victoria with terrifying force, sending them both tumbling hard onto the polished marble floor. The impact was sickeningly loud. A nearby banquet table tipped over under their combined weight, sending an avalanche of silver platters, heavy porcelain plates, and dozens of half-empty bottles of vintage red wine crashing down on top of them. The pristine $15,000 designer wedding gown that Victoria had worn like a crown was instantly obliterated. The delicate white silk tore violently against the sharp edges of the broken tableware. Huge pools of deep crimson wine soaked immediately into the expensive fabric, looking exactly like fresh blood spreading across a battlefield. The dress was smeared with dark soil from the overturned floral arrangements, and smeared heavily with the expensive makeup running down Victoria's terrified face. Jason pinned her to the ruined floor, screaming incoherent accusations, his hands wildly grasping at the tattered collar of her ruined dress. He demanded to know why she had done it, demanding to know where Arthur Vance was hiding. Victoria shrieked, thrashing her legs and kicking blindly as the beautiful illusion of her high society life was literally dragged through the dirt and broken glass. It was a pathetic, disgusting display of greed, turning inward and devouring itself. The federal agents did not hesitate for another second. They swarmed the struggling couple, joined instantly by heavily armed local police officers who had just breached the main lobby. The authorities descended upon the chaotic scene with overwhelming physical force. Two massive officers grabbed Jason by the shoulders, forcefully dragging him off his weeping wife and slamming him face first into the cold marble floor. They drove their knees into his back, pinning him down effortlessly. At the exact same time, the federal agents hauled Victoria back to her feet, roughly pushing her against the nearest structural pillar to secure her violently thrashing body. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly across the silent, stunned ballroom. First, the cuffs snapped tightly around the wrists of the brilliant tech chief executive officer, locking his arms behind his back. Then a second pair of steel restraints locked mercilessly around the delicate wrists of his aristocratic bride. I stood quietly near the front of the stage, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my tailored suit, watching their destruction. The heavy steel handcuffs secured behind his back forced Jason to contort his body awkwardly as the massive police officers hauled him up from the ruined marble floor. His previously immaculate designer suit was now entirely destroyed, heavily soaked in dark red wine and smeared with the crushed remains of the lavish floral centerpieces. Blood from a small, superficial cut on his forehead trickled slowly down his cheek, mixing with his tears and sweat. He was breathing in short, desperate gasps, his wide, panicked eyes darting frantically around the ballroom as he finally realized the absolute totality of his catastrophic downfall. The wealthy venture capitalists he had spent years courting were now staring at him with undisguised revulsion, actively backing away as if his mere presence were a contagious disease. Bradley Sterling was already speaking quietly, with his elite legal team completely erasing Jason and his fraudulent startup from their massive financial portfolio. Jason realized he had absolutely no one left in the world to protect him from the crushing weight of the federal justice system. He violently twisted his shoulders, desperately breaking away from the grip of the arresting officers for just a fraction of a second. He threw himself forward, crashing heavily onto his knees, directly at my feet. The sharp impact echoed in the quiet space that had formed around us. He awkwardly shuffled closer, craning his neck upward to look at me. His face twisted in a pathetic mask of sheer terror and profound desperation. "Dad, please," Jason begged, his voice cracking into a high, agonizing wail that carried across the silent room. "You cannot let them take me away. I am your son. You have the money to fix this. You have the lawyers. You can pay the bail. You can hire the best defense team in the country. Save me. Please, Dad, I am begging you. Save me." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken, weeping man kneeling on the floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar protective instinct of a father rushing to shield his child from harm. That instinct had been thoroughly eradicated the moment he chose to treat his own mother like disposable garbage to impress a room full of strangers. I slowly removed my hands from the pockets of my tailored charcoal suit and looked deeply into his panicked eyes. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring that every single person in the immediate vicinity was listening closely to the final verdict. I leaned down just an inch, bringing my face slightly closer to his, my expression radiating nothing but a terrifying, absolute coldness. "Save you?" asked my voice, smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I watched his eyes widen with a desperate, foolish glimmer of hope, believing for a split second that my question meant I was actually considering his pathetic plea. I let that false hope hang in the air before I systematically crushed it into dust. Sorry, Jason, I continued, ensuring my enunciation was perfectly clear and undeniably sharp. I am just a clueless old man. I certainly do not belong in a sophisticated elite place like this, and I definitely do not have the capacity to understand complicated legal problems. The horrifying realization slammed into him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He heard his own cruel, arrogant words thrown right back into his face, permanently sealing his fate. The glimmer of hope vanished from his eyes, instantly replaced by a deep, dark void of absolute despair. He slumped forward, his spirit entirely broken as the police officers finally stepped in and roughly dragged him away toward the holding transport. I did not stay to watch them push him through the grand double doors. I simply turned my back on the chaotic scene and began walking steadily toward the main exit. The crowd of wealthy investors and corporate elites parted before me with a profound, respectful silence. Nobody dared to utter a single word or attempt to block my path. I stepped out of the Palmer House Hilton and into the crisp, refreshing night air of downtown Chicago. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the towering skyscrapers, casting long, sweeping shadows across the dark pavement. I handed my valet ticket to the attendant, who retrieved my midnight black luxury sedan with remarkable speed and deep deference. I slipped into the comfortable leather driver's seat, starting the powerful engine with a quiet, satisfying hum. The drive back to the quiet suburban outskirts was peaceful, devoid of any traffic or disruption. I felt a tremendous, lifting weight completely vanish from my weary shoulders. The crushing anxiety that had plagued me since the beginning of the evening was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, enduring sense of absolute security. I pulled the sedan smoothly into my own private garage and quietly made my way inside the modest house. The soft, warm glow of a small reading lamp illuminated the quiet living room, offering a comforting contrast to the bitter cold night outside. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle with fresh water, and set it on the stove to boil. I prepared a delicate chamomile blend, carefully arranging 2 pristine white porcelain mugs on a beautiful wooden serving tray I had carved decades ago. I carried the warm tea into our bedroom, where Martha was finally resting comfortably, her breathing steady and calm. The dark bruise remained on her cheek, but the immediate environment around her was completely safe and perfectly peaceful. My vast commercial empire was heavily secured, my financial legacy was entirely protected, and the treacherous individuals who dared to harm my family were securely locked away in federal custody. I sat gently on the edge of the mattress, sipping the soothing tea in the quiet darkness, knowing with absolute certainty that our future was finally permanently and irrevocably safe. If there is one crucial lesson to take away from my story, it is that true power does not roar. It observes in silence. We often sacrifice our own peace and endure profound disrespect to protect the illusion of family. But blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-respect. Never let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, convince you that your dignity is the price of admission for their conditional love. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more life lessons. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your experiences in the comments below. Thank you for listening and stay strong.